Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Dambusters, the Bomber Band podcast with me, Jane Gulliford-Lowes, and my co-host, the inestimable James Jefferies. I think this is about our 23rd episode, and considering we only ever meant to do about 6, we're doing pretty well. So how are you, James, and what have you been up to? Anything much?
Good. No, the usual sort of teaching. I've gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole looking at the Battle of Blenheim. What on earth got me started on that, eh?
Well,
which is very, very interesting. Duke of Marlborough and... War of Spanish Succession and stuff, and it's got links to Churchill and. Of course,
you're taking your Blenheim obsession just too far. This is getting out.
Well, the thing was, it's come out of looking at history and realising I've got some big gaps. Like the English Civil War, I knew the basics of, but I didn't really know a lot more. So I was reading about that recently, and I think I said on an earlier pod I was looking at medieval history and such like. But it's good to kind of like test your historical muscles on other things.
Yeah, I'm kind of like Restoration, that sort of area, 18th century. I'm absolutely clueless on that. I haven't got a clue. I really need to fill in some gaps on that. So anyway. Right, and as for me, well, by the time this episode goes out, I should have been to Norway and back again, off to Oslo for a few days, so we're looking forward to that. Although the weather is closing in Scandinavia by the looks of things, so it could be pretty snowy while I'm out there, so I shall go prepared. Anyway, so let's crack on. So after last week's episode on video games, we thought it was time to get back to reality. So in this episode, we're going to be tackling the very thorny issue of measuring the success or otherwise of the Allied strategic bombing campaign in the European theatre. And as I once wrote in an article, opinions on bomber command are like belly buttons. We've all got one. So whether your knowledge is limited to having watched the Dambusters on a rainy Saturday afternoon or gleaned from years of academic research and debate, one thing is for sure. The strategic bombing campaign continues to divide opinion 80 years later. So even before the Second World War had ended, and probably almost non-stop since, debate has raged about whether the strategic bombing campaign was a war winner or an expensive, in terms of lives lost and resources expended, failure. What do you think, James?
Both the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, USSBS, and later report of the British Bombing Survey Unit, BBSU, concluded that, by and large, the strategic bombing campaign had failed to prevent huge increases in production of German aircraft and armaments during 1943 and 1944. Their research concluded that the main reasons for this were the undermobilization of the German war economy in the early years of the war, inaccuracy of bombing, and the dispersal of German industry in direct response to bombing. The targeting of oil production and transport were considered to be the only areas where the Allies enjoyed any significant success, and even then only in the later stages of the war. Expanding upon the criticisms identified in both reports, particularly those in the USBSS, and perhaps misinterpreting the findings in Webster and Franklin's Official History, the Strategic Air Offensive Against Germany, 1961, condemnation of the tactics and achievements of Allied bombing, particularly area bombing, became for many years, and certainly from the 1960s, favoured in academia and also informed popular opinion. The work of Overy and Biddle began to challenge the accepted historiography in the 1990s and sought to change the way in which the combined bomber offensive was viewed. More recently, historians such as O'Brien, Tooze and Harrison have sought to cast new perspectives on the impact of strategic bombing offensive. Although Malcolm Gladwell's recent book, The Bomber Mafia, and apologies for mentioning that book.
It's rubbish.
Come with a warning. It's terrible. Harks back to a criticism of the campaign in earlier decades. Now, I just want to bring in a tweet here by Alan Allport, previous guest of the pod, who actually wrote a very interesting thread about Malcolm Gladwell's book, Bombing Mafia. But the tweet here from Alan is, I am open to folks having all kinds of opinions about the bombing. What I dislike is when people think the issue is uncomplicated, either for or against. If you haven't sincerely grappled with it, if you're not troubled by it, all that tells me is that you don't understand it. And I think that's a very sort of good summary. I'm still getting to grips with this topic, still making sense of it. And we've had 80 years of discussion over it, and there's still no real clear answer. I don't think there is. I think there's far too nuanced with so much to consider, so many angles. And I think you could say this is a general thing with history. We like a simple yes or no answer, and that is very, very rarely the case.
Yeah. It's like the lawyer's answer, isn't it? Coming from the legal profession, as I have done. The answer is always, it depends. I think that's very much the case here as well. I know my own views change very, very regularly.
Ditto.
I mean, sort of literally from week to week, depending on what archival material I'm looking at, what sort of other interpretations I'm looking at from other historians, etc.
Absolutely.
So, I think that's probably a good thing, because I think it's a topic that you do have to remain open-minded on.
And it's probably one of the biggest reasons why we're still talking about it, is because there is so much to discuss. I'm certainly fascinated by it, because my opinion does change, and there's so many different voices, interpretations. And we'll have guests on that just make you think differently about things. Yeah,
absolutely. Right, let's crack on then. So the Casablanca Directive of January 1943 set out a generalised targeting strategy for the Allies, with submarine yards and aircraft production heading the list of favourite targets. And this strategy is then further refined by the Point Blank Directive of 14th of June, I think it was, 1943, which identified 19 industries crucial to the German war economy, with, again, fighter production at the top. So we're going to consider the impact of bombing as measured against the evolving objectives of the combined bomber offensive, and in particular from the time of the implementation of those directives of 1943 onwards, when US and British joint policy on bombing was pretty much crystallised, and the full weight of strategic bombing from both the RAF and the United States Army Air Force was brought to bear upon the German economy. So this is the sort of absolute peak of the bombing campaign, if you like, or the beginning of the peak. So one of the problems in measuring the success or otherwise of Bomber Command is that the objectives were constantly changing. Now, as we've discussed it in earlier episodes, the Bomber Command of June 1943 was a very different beast to the Bomber Command of June 1940. And obviously the arrival of the Americans into the war at the end of 1941 transformed the bombing war in Europe.
So what were the Allies trying to achieve at this time? Let's take a look at the broad aims of the strategic bombing offensive. So 1, the damaging and destruction of production facilities, focusing on submarines, aircraft and armaments, and the essential source materials, things like ball bearings, rubber, oil. 2, the disruption of enemy transport networks, especially rail and waterways. 3, the undermining of civilian morale and the workforce by attacking entire towns and cities. 4, the diversion of military resources away from the Eastern Front to air defence and from other war work. 5, destruction of the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground. And we're now going to examine each of these distinct aims individually.
Yeah, so first of all, we're going to have a look at the question of the damaging and destruction of production. Now, we could have we could dedicate a whole series of pods just to this particular topic. It's absolutely enormous, but we're going to try and condense it into 10 minutes because, that's just how we are. So both the United States Strategic Bombing Survey and the British Bombing Survey Unit reports concluded that German war production increased exponentially in 1943 and 1944. So this is at the absolute height of the bombing campaign before tailing off again at the end of that year. German industry produced something like 3 times as many weapons in 1944 as in 1941. And this increase in production has often been presented as evidence of the failure of strategic bombing to achieve its aims, and occasionally as a direct result of the bombing campaign itself. Now, there's no doubt that German industry was quick to adapt, although the fabric of factory buildings was often severely damaged or destroyed. The smaller items, such as machine tools and equipment, frequently survived and could just be picked up and taken elsewhere. Bombing was inaccurate, as we've discussed previously, and was largely unable to inflict sufficient pinpoint damage to cause production in any one particular industry or of any one particular component to cease. I think a prime example of that is the 1943 United States raids on the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, which apparently destroyed up to 50% of capacity, but yet the United States Bombing Survey concluded the attacks had no measurable effect on essential war production. And this is obviously in circumstances where they lost, I think, was it 98 aircraft and crews? So you can see where the arguments are coming from. And I also think it's surprising that the Allies failed to attack power supplies at all, having overestimated the maintenance repair capabilities of the German electricity supply network. I think, obviously, production was often dispersed to smaller and more scattered factories. And where shortages of components and materials did occur, those gaps seemed to be quickly filled up by almost a process of economic osmosis and adaptation, which I think was described by the economist Olson in 1962 as substitution theory. So basically how this works is that if one part of the economy or industry or even a particular factory is knocked out, the other parts sort of all move in to fill in the gap, if you like, in almost a semi-automatic way. And then, of course, you've got the factories being concealed by camouflage. You've got dummy sites built to divert the attention of incoming bombers, just like they were in the UK, of course, as well. Yeah, but also, you've got the range of products being produced is actually being reduced. I think this is one of the many criticisms of the German sort of war industry, is that they've got too many sort of types of everything, too many sort of fancy variations. So, for example, production was eventually streamlined and standardised to focus on the most essential items. So you've got, for example, the number of models of vehicles produced was reduced from 55 to 14. And who needs 55? Different models of vehicle. Yeah. Anti-aircraft guns from 10 to 2, fit it in. Yeah. Well, why fix it? You only need a couple of types, surely. And shortages of manpower were tackled by obviously drawing on labour resources from throughout occupied Europe through forced labour, and then later the exploitation of inmates from concentration and labour camps. Obviously, as bombing intensified in 1944 as well, you've got some production facilities being moved underground at the cost of tens of thousands of lives of slaves and forced labourers. So as the bombing survey unit identified, with the increasing experience of air attack, the Germans became more skilled at diverting the effects of the air attack onto the civilian economy as well. And I think both the BBSU and the American survey concluded that the German war economy had not been fully mobilised up until around 1942, and that there was some spare capacity. I know this has been a very controversial sort of argument. Yeah. And I know Richard Overy in particular dealt with this, and he said that it's basically rubbish. And it was a deliberate gamble by a Nazi government banking on a short war, but rather that it was the level of investment and production were mismatched due to institutional failures to embrace mass production and military interference. And the mass production finally achieved in 1944 was basically what the economy had promised to live up to, if you like, and it came from utilising resources more effectively, even under Allied bombing, and also making increasing use of the supply of female workers as well, which is something which doesn't often get touched upon in the context of German production.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. But do these increases in production necessarily mean that the bombing offensive had failed in its primary goal? I think you've got to look at what might have been. What would have happened if the bombing hadn't occurred? What would production have been like then? How many more tanks, aircraft, etc. could have been created had the bombing not happened? And I think Albert Speer, who's never a very reliable source of evidence, that's for sure.
I've got lots to say on him. Yeah.
God, yeah. He was a slippery customer, wasn't he? Dear me.
Oh, yeah.
I still can't comprehend how he ever didn't got
away with
the chop,
it. Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. Spears stated that but for the bombing campaign, production levels would have been 30 to 40% higher. Planned production was much higher than what was actually produced in 43 and 44. For example, the Germans were able to build 5 fewer tanks than they expected in 44 and 31% fewer aircraft because of Allied bombing. So it's all this sort of big gap between expectation and reality and what is actually achievable, and how bombing was basically able to put a cap on that, if you like, and stop them implementing their plans for massively increased production. So I think where the combined bombing offensive succeeded then was in placing a cap on production, destroying the slack, and preventing industrial increase from rising even higher than it actually did. Do you think about
I also think as well, it's influencing what's being produced. So, For example,
Definitely.
when it comes to aircraft, you say, that there's more aircraft being produced. How many are bombers? How many are fighters? I seem to remember, probably someone will correct me here, that fighter production, I think there's 8,000 produced in 1944, but the plan was 12,000. Again, that's fighters, and the bomber production goes down during the course of the war. The same goes with, 88 millimeter anti-aircraft guns. There's more of them being produced than what's needed because they're needed to defend the Reich and such like. So there's a very, very defensive, and you're not going to win a war like that. And what you mentioned as well with the short war with Germany, it absolutely can't afford to be in a long war. How could it? You look at what the Allies had with the resources around the world, and Germany just has Germany. There's not a lot of time there. People talk a lot about the battle for oil and such like. I know we'll touch on that later with sort of like the strategies there. But these are other things to consider, and I think what is being produced is a key thing here.
Yeah, I think you've also got to look at the question of sort of a rationalised economy with fewer and larger factories is potentially more vulnerable to bombing, because if you've only got 3 factories instead of 10, and one of them gets knocked out, then obviously the impact is going to be greater, isn't it? The knock-on effect. So the fact that they're having to disperse the factories, and obviously that creates an increased dependence on transport networks, which is what we're going to be coming onto next, is a clear sign that bombing is sort of handicapping rationalisation, if you like. And that in itself makes transport links a more attractive target. Because if you're having to produce your components in Hamburg and then ship them off to, I don't know, Wuppertal to be assembled, and then someone's bombing the transport networks in between, bombing the railway lines or whatever in between, that's going to create you problems, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there's just so much to be gone into. It's sort of layers and layers and layers of nuance, isn't it? And there's just no fixed answer, as we've discussed at the beginning. So, do you want to go on to our next topic then, James?
So, you've kind of cut into that quite nicely, actually, there, which is the destruction of the enemy transport networks. I see what you did there. That was wonderfully done. I mean, I've talked about this in terms of the transportation plan 1944 and the surveys both. Yeah, there's question marks over how much it affected the transportation. But again, sort of my conclusion, and I do want to look further into it, is that it's still a pain. And it is, especially with the control of the sky and such like, it is a nuisance. And it's not just bombing rail links and such like, it is also the roads and having the fighter bomber element and the tactical air force. And that's actually another thing generally to look at here is we can think of this as strategic bombers, and we're probably falling into the Lancaster by night narrative of Bomber Command, when of course it was much, much more than that. And I think that this is another thing that plays into destruction of enemy transport networks. It was, the tactical air force as well behind the line, stopping transportation of armaments and troops by day, certainly. And you think about something like the Tiger tank, that's not being transported by road, A, because it's going to be incredibly slow, B, because it uses up a lot of fuel, and C, it's just going to tear up the road and be a nuisance for anyone else travelling on it. So I think it is a case of looking at the railways, and if you're constantly causing delays and the fact that these are being repaired, it's going to have a massive effect on the transportation. And I think Bomber Command does an incredible job, along with the United States Army Air Force, during the course of that summer of 1944.
Yeah, I think it's easy to sort of forget just how dependent Germany was, not just in military sense, but sort of as a nation, dependent on the railway system. It was absolutely crucial to the life of the country, if you like. And it was crucial to industry, and particularly more so, as we've just mentioned, about after the process of dispersal began. One thing I also wanted to mention, again, in the context of attacks on enemy transport networks, something which I rant on about all the time, as you know, my favourite topic, and that is mine laying. And that never gets mentioned about it, sort of in the context of transport. But that's exactly what it was. It was part of the attack on transportation and logistics. And if you're targeting the Danube, or you're targeting, the Kiel Canal or whatever, laying mines in there, you are disrupting German logistics and transport network. And that's something which is really, really important. And also, if you are attacking railways and attacking road networks and sort of city transport hubs, you are then forcing logistics to look for different means of transporting goods and men and material. And one of those methods is by sea, by coastal transport. And then again, that's where the mining comes in. So they can't transport them by road, they can't transport them by rail, they can't transport them by canal, and now they can't transport them through coastal routes either, because of the mining. So it all fits and it all sort of segs together. And I think there's such a temptation to try and view sort of different elements of the campaign in isolation. And you can't. That's the thing.
Yeah.
It's all part and parcel. It's all a giant web, if you like, of different elements all coming together to achieve an overall result. A couple of other points that I just want to mention was that the bombing of transportation targets could really only begin to have an enormously disruptive impact on the German war economy once they reached a certain scale, and this is sort of back end of 1944. It's only then when the German and to a lesser extent French railway systems really begin to seize up in the autumn of that year that the real impacts began to be felt. Bombing marshalling yards in Hamburg or somewhere is fine, but unless you're doing it everywhere else as well, it's not going to have any sort of impact on logistics. So it's that gradual build-up, the wearing down, if you like, of the transport network. And I think one point which is being made is that if any criticism can be made of the campaign against transportation, it should have been started much earlier and on a much larger scale, and perhaps would have had more impact. I think one statistic which absolutely blows my mind is that something like 72% of the bombs dropped on Germany by the Allies fell after the 1st of July 1944.
That's an incredible stat, isn't it?
Isn't that just incredible? And that's precisely when the main damage to the transport targets took place. So again, sort of linking it back to the production issue, attacks on production could only really succeed when the transportation links, which underpinned the supply of raw materials or the distribution of finished goods, had been dismantled by bombing. So again, it's that whole sort of segging together of all these different elements, I think. Yeah. Anything else you want to add to that particular one?
Just really that, as we said, that the sum of all parts, this is just one part of it. The fact that they're not being used for numerous other tasks. And we talked about it in the Battle of Britain episode. They're not just bombing airfields, they're bombing, they're doing the mine laying and they're doing the Battle of the Bulge and such like that. That's on an even grander scale by the end of the war, the last year or two of the war. On top of that, there is this technological battle. So, they have to improve accuracy. They have to improve the means of going out. So you have things like the Pathfinder Force, the Master Bombers, etc. Then there's the technical level of defence and evasion. And you have the ground radar and such like. And some don't work, some do. The development of bombers as well. I mean, we talk about the Halifax, the Lancaster. They weren't incredible when they first came in the sense of they did have technical issues and there were problems with engines and such like. These were teething things that had to be developed. And in the long term effect of it, I mean, you look at what the Aircraft Bomber Command went to war with at the start compared to the end. Very, very different. And this again had to be learned and developed, as well as building up that force just from scratch. And again, this is something we talked about, building all those airfields, training all those crews, getting all those ground personnel, the infrastructure of making it work. These are all other things that it's having to deal with, as well as the Luftwaffe developing. Schrager music didn't happen suddenly. That was developed out of tactics and the way that these enemy fighters patrolled and worked with ground radar and such like. So they've got all that to contend with, as well as the strategy, as well as the different ways of approaching, having numerous targets to go for. So it's incredibly draining.
Yeah. Right. Let's go on to probably the most controversial topic of them all. This is number 3 on the hit list, and that is the undermining of civilian morale. So I think one of the mainstays of the combined bomber offensive was the controversial targeting of German civilian morale. And I think this is perhaps the most difficult of all of the aims of the combined bomber offensive to actually measure. I mean, how do you measure that? Although the Americans did not formally adopt Bomber Command's policy of dehousing, well, unless you talk about in Japan, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. We'll talk about that later. In reality, the limitations of precision bombing, particularly in bad weather, meant that in effect the United States Army Air Force also participated in area bombing, whether they like to admit it or call it that or not. Yep. I think the United States bombing survey found that civilian morale had been impacted to some degree, but not sufficiently to force capitulation on a totalitarian regime. I think one of the historian Pape points out that despite depression, of course you're going to be depressed if your house has been flattened, most workers simply continued to work in a routine fashion. And as the American survey observed, depressed and discouraged workers were not necessarily unproductive workers. For many of those whose homes had actually been destroyed, going to work provided them with a sense of purpose, security and routine. For some, it was all they had left. And obviously in a totalitarian state, absenteeism is just not an option. You go to work because, you get shot or whatever if you don't. And I think bombing attacks on towns and city centres did not translate into the hoped for extensive work absenteeism. And factories tended to be situated on the outskirts of urban areas anyway, with their workforces living close by rather than sort of in the hearts of cities. I think the statistics from the Reich Economics Ministry showed that bombing only contributed to a small increase in lost hours in 1944, although the figures obviously vary hugely from industry and from area to area, with absenteeism higher in the western part of the country. So obviously you're looking like Euro Valley kind of areas where there's extremely heavy bombing, Hamburg, etc. So throughout 1944, the statistics suggest that hours worked in 12,000 firms surveyed actually increased from 976 million in March to 1,063 million in the October. However, you've also got to take into account the increasing reliance upon millions of slave and forced labourers and prisoners of war, which sort of negated this policy of attacking morale. Because so many of those, in quotation marks, employed in the German war economy simply had no choice. They were slaves or prisoners. And the light bombing and the policy of dehousing was almost an irrelevance in that context, as any workers killed or injured in bombing would just be simply replaced by the next load of prisoners or slave labourers. Yeah. But getting back to the whole sort of morale question, I know what the United States bombing survey said. I know what the British bombing survey said. But you've also got to take into account the effect of bombing in the UK as well, in particular sort of the Blitz and all this sort of myth of the Blitz spirit. I mean, there's a whole other episode that we could go into there. But again,
I'd love to,
yeah, it didn't have the impact that the people thought it would, because ultimately, and weird as it sounds, people did get used to it, and life went on to some degree. Having said that, the scale of the bombing in Germany, it can't have had no effect. It just can't. I mean, when you see somewhere like Hamburg or Essen or those sorts of places, they'll be absolutely flattened. You can't tell me that's not having any effect on the civilian population. So it's such a tricky one to try and measure, really. I think it's such an amorphous concept, really, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a topic that's very, very difficult, and it does feel like you're stepping on eggshells when it comes to it, because there's so much to consider, and it's very, very easy to slip up. But I think, the mention of the Blitz on Britain, that's not to say that everybody, had this Blitz spirit. And again, there's so much to discuss. There were people that were obviously massively affected with it. But then you did have the propaganda side of it, and there is some fake propaganda. I mean, one that is quite famous that comes to mind is the image of the milkman still on his milk round with the destroyed street. The one we put the picture up on Twitter. Well, that was faked. It was the cameraman's assistant that did it, and a lot of people see it and they go, "Oh yeah, that's the Blitz spirit right there." And I'm sorry, that's fake. There's better images to show that, and also there's a lot more to discuss. It's not simple. Going back to the Alan Allport discussion, it's really not that simple. But ultimately, as a collective thing, it does get backs up. It calls for revenge. It calls for, hitting back. That's one thing that is voiced. Equally, there are voices. The Archbishop of Canterbury is one example, but there are others that say, well, should we be hitting back like this? But I think another thing to remember about the bombing war as a whole is it does escalate over the course of the war as animosity grows, as there are not only bombings, but also shortages and loved ones suffering and battles raging and the scale constantly going up and up. And this is something to consider as well. And it's both sides slowly escalating it as well. This is total war.
Yeah. And I think that the scale of the German casualties, or civilian casualties I'm talking about here, of Allied bombing is just so enormous that it's just difficult to contemplate. I think something like, is it 60,000 people are killed in the UK through air raids, I think, throughout the whole course of the war. I'm not just talking about the Blitz. Throughout the whole course of the war, I think something like 60,000. But then when you look at Germany, I think it's something in the region, is it between about 500, 600,000, something like that in total?
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that, yeah. It is enormous. I mean, if you compare, say, the amount who were killed in the Blitz in sort of the early stages of the war, it's about 44,000, I think, which is an enormous number of people. It's just utterly horrific. But then when you consider that a similar number were killed in the bombing of Hamburg in July 43, in a couple, just in...
It's about 45,000?
Yeah. That's in two or three nights, something like that.
Yeah.
It is just utterly horrific. It just brings up so many sort of really, really difficult issues about casualties, about statistics, and the whole thing. Whichever way you look at it, it's just utterly horrific. There's just no,
I think the other...
Not
it is.
It
is. I can't picture that number. I don't think I ever will. Out of interest, I say about 600, 700,000 German civilians killed. I think Britain lost about 700,000 during the First World War through, armed service personnel killed.
Yeah.
I think it's about 1 million if you count the Empire and the Commonwealth. I'm sure that's the figure. Again, someone might correct me, but it just goes to show just what scale the Second World War is on. Another thing as well, I mean, as well as being a totalitarian regime to keep, people going to work and them having that resolve through the bombing, you've also got, as this escalates near the end of the war, the bombing and the scale of it, and more towns are being affected that weren't bombed before, which is another thing to consider as the bombers are able to go further in. You've got Goebbels saying, well, this is justification to fight because they've said unconditional surrender and now they're bombing every city. They want to destroy the German people, the German culture, the German way of life. And of course, that's going to get a lot of people's backs up, as well as what's happening on the Eastern Front. You look at what happens when the Soviet troops go into East Prussia and the killings and the mass rapes and such like that happened there. All of this is combining to keep a nation fighting. Yeah. So, these are other things to consider.
Yeah. I think we should move on to our next topic, so otherwise we'll be here all night.
We will. That's a pod in its own, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, absolutely. And that is number 4 on the hit list is diversion of resources. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Joe?
Yeah, and I mean, this is one that's talked about a lot when it comes to Bomber Command's war. And I mean, we briefly talked about it, haven't we, with the diversion of resources, also the resources that are being made, etc. But the argument is, and actually this is said during the war, when, that there's no ability really for the Allies for certainly a certain point to have that second front, certainly not in France until, initially they say May 43, but then it becomes June 44. The bombing war can be that front because Stalin wants that relief. He wants some sort of effort. It doesn't matter what's happening in North Africa. And even when, you have Operation Torture in North Africa and then you have Sicily and Italy, it's still not really enough. And the bombing war is kind of like seen as this justification of this other front. And that's one of the arguments pushed through. And on top of that, it is diverting resources, not just material, but also, human power, manpower. And this is, again, one of the arguments that's put forward for Bomber Command being a success is it is this factor that's causing this diversion of resources for a good number of years.
Yeah, I think it's sort of almost considered one of the, in quotation marks, successors of the combined bomber offensive. Yeah, I know Philip's Payson O'Brien is very good on this. His book, How was it How the War Was Won? I love that book. It's brilliant. He argues that taking German war production as a whole, from 1943 onwards, the Allies were responsible for tying down and destroying a significantly larger share than the Soviet Union, and that the strategic bombing campaign played a significant part in this. I mean, that's probably quite a controversial opinion, but it's certainly an interesting view. But from the summer of 1943 and implementation of point blank, the defence of Germany from attacks from the air received the greatest priority as men, fighter aircraft, anti-aircraft guns and equipment are all shifted from every other front in an urgent response to sort of large-scale round-the-clock bombing from the Allies. Did that draw too much away from the fighting the war in the East or not enough? I think that's a point that we could argue, again for days onwards. But basically, labour is being used from whatever source to defend against Allied bombing, which could have been used elsewhere for myriad different purposes. And I think, again, is it O'Brien who makes the point that by January 1944, within 6 months of point blank, 54% of all Luftwaffe operational frontline strength is in Germany or occupied Western Europe, with the specific aim of resisting the bomber offensive. The German Secretary of State for the Air Ministry demanded a massive increase in fighter production. That's the point that you were making earlier about how the number of fighters being produced increases massively, observing that Germany itself is now the front line. So you've got vast amounts of investment, you've got raw materials, you've got manpower, all being diverted to build fighters and enormous anti-aircraft defences. I mean, look at those flak towers in Berlin and in Hamburg and in Vienna. They're absolutely bloody enormous. And over 1 million personnel are being required to man all these defences. Therefore, you're depriving other parts of the economy of much needed labour. And you're also compelling increased reliance on less efficient forced and slave labour rather than skilled labour. You have to sort of look at it in the round. And I think some of the points that we've touched on before about the attacks on infrastructure and transport meant that it became increasingly difficult for the Germans to deploy the fruits of this increased production to wherever they needed to be. So it's all right producing, thousands more tanks or thousands more planes in 1943, 1944. But the point is, how do you then get them to where they need to be, whether it's the Eastern Front, whether it's Italy or Western Europe or, wherever they need to go? That's the problem of actually getting them to where they need to be. And also, you haven't got the manpower, you haven't got the air crews in particular to actually fly these additional aircraft. So you're relying on increasingly inexperienced air crew, which again creates its own problems because you're just losing more and more aircraft. And it's like a circular. Well, it's a spiral, really, isn't it? There's just so much to be gone into.
I guess the other thing is we're kind of on the point here, aren't we, about the destruction of the Luftwaffe? You've raised an absolutely brilliant one there, which is the training of aircrew. You can't train a fighter pilot overnight. They need a lot of training. And the other thing is with these multiple fronts, and 43 onwards, you have Italy as well as the Soviet Union, and you have the air war over Northwest Europe as well. There is nowhere where it's safe really to train these pilots. And they need to train them quickly as well because of how many they're losing. And this is a point that's often raised, is the training experience compared to Allied aircrew, I think is a third or a fourth of the flying hours that the Allied aircrew have with the Luftwaffe. Because the Allied aircrews, they can take their time. They've got massive resources. They've got a huge base of people that can be trained. And it's not a case of everyone who volunteers to be aircrew suddenly becomes a fighter pilot. Most get rejected and they end up doing something else. That's not necessarily the case with the Luftwaffe. And they can train in Canada, in the deserts of, I don't know, sort of South Africa or Australia or whatever, where it's safe. All they'll do is, there are training accidents. Of course there are. These aircraft are put together with string and glue. But they have that safety to be able to do that. The Luftwaffe don't, and they're having to rush these pilots through. So when they come to going into combat, they're really not experienced with these machines that are very, very difficult to use. On top of that, there's the projects as well, where people I don't know, I might get on my soapbox here a little bit, but people get excited about sort of like the 262 and the jets and all this sort of stuff. Well, there's a lot of hours going into that, and they're not that reliable. They have engine problems. They are limited
vanity
to how long they're in the air.
Really, I think.
They're vanity projects, absolutely. Yeah. They're not going to make a massive difference. And there's arguments over whether they should be used as fighter bombers and all this sort of stuff. Meanwhile, the Allies can churn out loads of Mustangs and Spitfires and... You know, the fact that you do have these fighter aircraft that have the extra long fuel tanks and such like in 44, 45 also makes a difference. You look at the factors of Operation Argument, Big Week and all the rest of it. But they are vanity products. And even the V weapons, which is really, you know, in terms of a reaction to the bombing of what's happening in Germany, they're useless. Most don't actually reach their target. And yes, there is tremendous destruction, but it's nothing compared to what's happening in Germany. And as soon as the troops move forward, the V1s are out of range. And yeah, even the V2s, it's difficult to transport them and build them. And slave labor, they're getting wrecked as well on the ground. And you look at what's happening. Another part of Bomber Command, you have Operation Goodwood and such like, which is causing delays with this. Yeah, and like you say, it's a vanity project as well.
Yeah, I think Professor... Is it Mark Harrison makes an interesting point that aircraft for aircraft, the Allies lost more aircrew sort of in the second half of the war, if you like. So, say, for example, a Halifax or a Lancaster's got a crew of 7, a B-17's got a crew of 10, while a Luftwaffe fighter's probably going to be single crewed, isn't it? I think both sides lost around 40,000 aircraft in the end, I think were his figures. That's just unimaginable, isn't it? Yeah. But the point that he makes is that the Allies are better placed to sustain, absorb and quickly replace losses of both men and machines, whereas the Germans are not, that they're running out of both. Yeah. They're running out of sort of raw materials, they're running out of resources, and they are running out of men. The point that he makes is that the air war succeeded in forcing Germany to incur major costs to defend it. And I think that's a really good point. Anyway, let's go on to our final thing, which is the destruction of the Luftwaffe. We've already touched on this a little bit. So by targeting production facilities and resources, the Allies had originally hoped to cripple the Luftwaffe, thereby paving the way for the eventual ground invasion. But one of the incidental effects of the strategic bombing campaign resulted in the destruction of the Luftwaffe, not on the ground as planned, but rather in the air. So you've got fighter aircraft being diverted from other fronts, and you've got newly produced fighters. All these new aircraft that they're producing are being thrown straight into the fray, as we've said, often with inexperienced pilots, with the aim of targeting Allied bombers on the way to and from target areas. I think 1,500 Luftwaffe fighters are lost in combat on the Western Front between July and November 1943 alone. God, that's huge. Can that be right? That's absolutely.
And that's one front.
Yeah, that's one front.
Yeah.
And while losses of Allied aircraft are high, particularly during Operation Argument, that's Big Week, isn't it? February 1944. Yeah. American aircraft and crews in particular are very easily replaced. They've got massive numbers of both just kind of waiting in the wings, trying to, ready to come through. As we've said, German resources are finite. Those available to the Americans were also finite, but many times greater. But obviously we've got the introduction of the long-range fighter escorts, in particular the P-51 Mustang in 1944. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I know you're really good on all this fighter stuff.
Am I?
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I mean, it takes a while in coming, doesn't it? But it does play a major fact that you do have these long-range fighters and that they're given free rein really to go after the Luftwaffe and such like. And I think the Mustang's an incredible aircraft. I mean, that's a separate sort of discussion really about whether it was the best. And there's also a discussion about could it have been done with Spitfire sooner? And I don't think so. I think there is a conscious effort to build fuel tanks, but there are problems with them. The way, and even when you get the more successful drop tanks and such like, they're not without technical problems. Sometimes they don't release and such like, and there is very much a learning curve with this. But Big Week, and this is another thing is, it's not just, this is part of the combined offensive, that's decided at point blank. And you've recently had the Battle of Berlin Bomber Command. And yeah, it's horrendous. The terms of losses, the tech is definitely on the side of the Luftwaffe at that point. But these fighter pilots are being used day and night, and you do have the night fighters going up against the B-17s and the Liberators and such, like the American Air Forces. So they are being stretched night and day. And a lot of people say, it goes suddenly into the Americans' hands. And this is the argument I say, no, it is still a combined bombing offensive if you look at it from a grander point of view of what's happening. It is this around-the-clock bombing. Okay, maybe it's not in the ways that it was envisaged, but it is working in terms of absolutely draining the Luftwaffe. And the key point that happens is big week when you do have the developments in fighter technology that is able to escort them deep into Germany. And I mean, this is unheard of. And generally, fighters are seen, certainly before the war and as the war comes in, as they only need to be short range. They're there to stop the bombers. The bombers are the big, they're going to come through and just absolutely knock everything out. We need fighters that just go up, do their job. That's it. And actually, if you make a fighter any bigger and you put loads of fuel in it, because there's no concept of fuel tanks at that point, it's just going to make it slower and more liable to blow up and such like. And that's why actually I'm going off on a tangent a little bit, but when it comes to like the Bolton Paul Defiant, that I always describe that as a fighter designed by committee, because it's you look at it, and there's a lot of First World War design with it as well. But actually, when you expect it to only go against bombers without a fighter escort, because fighters don't have the range to reach Britain from Germany, and this is before the fall of France and such like, they're actually quite interesting. Okay, that design kind of works. And when they're not being attacked by 109s, they are able to shoot down bombers and such like. But of course, that's not how the war plays out, and they're seen as one of the worst fighters ever, although as a little bit of a stopgap when it comes to night fighting. But there's a lot to learn with fighter aircraft throughout the war, how they develop. And as the means of how bombers are used changes, so does the means of fighters being used. And because the Americans are mainly by day, it's their fighters that get the priority of drop tanks and such like. Yeah, the British are starting to bomb by day, but still mainly by night, certainly end of 43 into 44. And that's why you have this come about.
Yeah, Richard Overy makes a really great point that I just never sort of thought about this in this context before. And this is with regard to the problem of unescorted bombers. And he says that for too long it was assumed that heavily armed bombers could defend themselves. But in reality, he makes the comparison that they were like unescorted merchant ships at the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, which I think is a great comparison. And to deliver their deadly cargoes, they needed to be escorted. And there's no question that once that actually began to happen, it made a considerable difference. But there we go. Anyway. Right. Gosh, we're quite a way through already. We've been talking for absolutely ages. Shall we draw some conclusions together then on this discussion?
I think so. Yeah, sounds good. Do you want to go first, or shall I just chip in?
Yeah, go on then. I'll go first. So I think in terms of looking at what the bombing campaign was meant to do, I think you've got to sort of look at the way that the objectives actually evolved. Pre-war, it was considered that the bombers would achieve the knockout blow. That didn't happen. It did not bring about the destruction of German morale, nor did it deprive the German war economy of the ability to produce aircraft and armaments. There's a great quote from Tammy Davis Biddle, who wrote a really excellent book on strategic air war. And she says that the Allies underestimated the robustness of urban societies and economies in response to bombing, but overestimated the probable efficiency and or accuracy of that bombing. And I think that sentence just about sums up the bomber offensive, to be honest. Obviously, the cost to the Allies of prosecuting the bombing war against the German war economy in terms of investment, resources, and the loss of men and machines was absolutely vast. I think it's something like 55,571 RAF personnel, aircrew, and a similar number of United States Army Air Force aircrew. Is it that many, or is it about 20,000? I can't remember. Lost their lives in any event, it is absolutely horrific numbers.
Yeah.
Thousands more taken prisoner or injured. So I think that while a number of the traditional criticisms can be partially justified, particularly the failure to target oil and transport at an earlier stage, the failure to attack power generating capabilities at all, and the failure to destroy civilian morale, measured against the aims of the combined bomber offensive, the Allied bombing did achieve success in some crucial areas, although perhaps not in the manner originally intended. I think perhaps the main area of success, if you want to call it that, was the creation of the second front and diverting aircraft, manpower and armaments and resources from the war in the East, thereby ultimately aiding the Soviet advance. And although production did increase, the numbers of aircraft, tanks, ordnance and equipment fell far short of that planned to be produced by the German government. Production, as we've said, was pretty much capped by the bombing campaign, and it sort of destroyed the slack, if you like, soaking up increases in production. Certainly the campaign against transportation infrastructure, I think, was very successful in the later stages, and restricted the ability of the Germans to deploy the fruits of that increased production to the places where they needed to get it to. So whether that be the East, whether it to be the Western Front, whatever. But perhaps the greatest impact then is the one that was unforeseen, and that was the destruction of the Luftwaffe in combat. What do you think about that, James?
But I think that there's a lot of things really to think about, and context is a massive thing when it comes to the bombing war, and that's including the build up to it. So you mentioned the knockout blow, and this is a phrase that's used a lot with the bomber. Why is there this focus on it? Well, when you think about it, and the legacy of the First World War, it's a new technology that can potentially stop that slaughter on the Western Front. It's used in the interwar years to, use a quote, police the empire, such at a lower cost, and potentially now it could win a war very, very short at a low cost. And there is lots and lots of theory over this. Culturally, there is this fear of the bomber, and you see it in films and novels and such like. And I really, really recommend Brett Holman's work on this. He's written a brilliant book about it, to the point where there might not even be a need for ground forces. You have the theorists like Douay and such like that saying actually the bomber could do this. With that, the legacy of the First World War, there is this idea that the Germans are just not up to it. You look at the blockade, the naval blockade, which is again something that, with the mine laying and everything is played in during the Second World War. A little nod to you there, Jane, with your research. And you have you have this in 1918, and eventually the naval mutiny over this. And there's this theory, actually, give it time, the German population are just not up to it, which is, as we've discussed, nonsense. I think, really, really summing it down, these are things that need to be considered. And trying to avoid that Western Front. This is certainly something that Harris, with the philosophy, comes in with, of trying to avoid, the ground fighting and such. Like, could be a medium line.
Steel, not flesh again, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. It absolutely is that. So it fits in with wider doctrines here about it. And he even says in his, I know it's been quoted so much, but the Germans think they can bomb everybody else and no one's going to bomb them. Well, we're going to launch at a new scale and we're going to see how it works out. Yeah, this is one of the theories, and it's on top of all of these other things. I think if we look at the bombing campaign on its own, there are, as we've said, a lot of questions. There are some elements that, again, you measure what you call successful, but some that contribute to the war effort more than others. Some that have definitely questions that need to be asked. Measured on its own, yeah. But if we look at it and we take away that sort of pre-war, the bomber will always get through, Stanley Baldwin sort of mentality towards it, and we look at it as part of a collected Allied effort, which there definitely needs to be boots on the ground, that is a big thing, then I think it plays a massive part in it. That's my sort of summary anyway.
Yeah. I think... Yeah.
You jump in.
Well, then, I think, although the campaign was not, as the Allies originally hoped, a war-winning strategy in itself, I think its contribution to the overall victory of the Allies at the time when that victory was won was significant. I'll put it that way.
I would agree with you there. There we go.
Oh, it was great.
Gosh, we covered a lot, haven't we?
We certainly have.
But
right, we're going to have to wrap up now, actually. Yeah, because we're running out of time.
Yeah.
So.
Yes. So as always, do give us a follow on social media. We're on X, Twitter and Instagram, also on YouTube. And please continue to send us your questions. We absolutely love them. Don't also forget to leave us a review or star rating wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to help us produce more great content, and it really, really is keeping us going, please hit that subscribe button in the show notes. For as little as $3, £2.40 a month, you'll receive priority access to new episodes and invitations to live streams and recording sessions. Next is on the 17th of November, so if you'd like to join us for that, well, now you know what to do. We're really looking forward to chatting with you all and answering all of your questions and hopefully debating some controversial issues.
Controversy, that's not like us, dear me. Anyway.
I know.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for listening, everyone. I really enjoyed that discussion. I hope you did too. And we'll see you all again next time. Bye.